the ever caught your shadow moving just a little too late. A flicker in your peripheral vision that you dismiss as a trick of the light. For Daniel, that slight delay was the beginning of the end. At first, he thought it was just his shadow, until it refused to leave. Daniel was a man of routine. Wake up, coffee, work, home, sleep, predictable, safe. But one evening, as he stood in his dimly lit kitchen, something felt wrong. He reached for a glass, and his shadow on the wall seemed to hold back for a fraction of a second before mimicking the motion. He froze, testing it again. He raised his hand slowly. The shadow followed. He dropped it quickly. The shadow glided down a moment later, unnaturally smooth. He told himself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. The strange angles of the new LED bulbs he'd installed. There was a logical explanation for everything. But the incidents grew more frequent, more blatant. Walking down the street, his shadow would stretch and contort, clinging to the side of a building long after he'd passed. In his office, he'd turn his head, Ethan. For a split second, the dark silhouette on the wall behind him would remain perfectly still before reluctantly catching up. It was subtle, so subtle that anyone else would miss it. But it was his shadow. He knew its every line and curve, and this was an imposter. Fear began to curdle in his stomach. He started experimenting, performing a grim ballet in his living room. He'd jump, E3, and the shadow would land a heartbeat too late. He'd wave, and the shadow's wave would be slightly out of sync, its fingers seeming to curl with a will of their own. It was a game of mimicry where the copy was becoming defiant. One afternoon, he stood perfectly still, holding his breath, staring at his dark twin cast upon the floor. He was, unblinking, as the shadow's head tilted slightly to the side, an inquisitive gesture he himself did not make. A cold dread washed over him. It wasn't just lagging anymore. It was observing. The nights became the worst. He'd wake up in the pitch-black darkness of his bedroom, a primal instinct screaming that he was not alone. There, in the corner, where no light could possibly reach, was a shape, a patch of darkness, deeper than the surrounding gloom, vaguely map-shaped his shadow. Standing, watching. He'd bolt upright, flicking on the lamp, and it would instantly snap back to its rightful place at the foot of his bed, tethered and innocent. But he knew what he had seen. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. Daniel's world started to shrink. Began avoiding bright lights, hoping to starve the thing that haunted him. He'd walk on the shady side of the street, keep his curtains drawn during the day, and use only the dimmest of lamps at night. But it made no difference. The shadow was no longer a product of light and obstruction. It was an entity in itself. It would appear on the ceiling above his bed, on the blank wall of a windowless hallway. A constant, silent companion that was always too close. He felt its presence like a drop in temperature, a heavy pressure in the air. He looked in the mirror one morning and barely recognized the man staring back. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide with sleepless terror. He looked faded, translucent, but as his gaze drifted to the reflection of the wall behind him, he saw the shadow, less, darker, sharper, more defined than ever before. It seemed to be absorbing his substance, growing more solid as he became more ethereal. Friends he bumped into would comment on his appearance. "You look tired, man," they'd say. "Like you're a ghost." They had no idea how right they were. 2. The whispers started soon after. They weren't from the room, not an external sound. They came from within, a soft, sibilant echo in his mind. Time to get up. He'd think, and a moment later, a quiet murmur would repeat it. I'm so tired. The whisper agreed. This has to end. the whisper affirmed. It was no longer just mimicking his movements. It was now echoing his thoughts, anticipating them. He tried to think of nothing, to empty his mind. Bored, the whisper would fill the void, suggesting thoughts that felt like his own, but weren't. It wasn't following him. It was learning him, inhabiting him. The final days were a blur of paranoia. He locked himself in his apartment, covering the mirrors with sheets and taping black garbage bags over the windows. But the shadow was always there, a permanent stain on his reality, detached from the walls, and now clung to his very being, a second skin of pure darkness. When he moved, he felt a strange resistance, a sluggishness, as if wading through unseen molasses. His own reflection in the darkened TV screen was slow to respond, a hazy, delayed image, while the shadow pulsed with a vibrant, stolen life. He couldn't take it anymore. Driven by a final, desperate surge of defiance, Daniel ripped the bags from the largest window, flooding the living room with the harsh glare of a sting lamp. He stood in the center of the light, his body casting a long, sharp silhouette on the floor. He screamed at it, his voice cracking with exhaustion and terror. "What do you want from me? What do you want?" Silence. The shadow on the floor stirred. Slowly, unnaturally, it began to peel itself away from his feet. It rose, not as a flat projection, but as a three-dimensional figure of living darkness. It stood before him, a perfect copy, and in the suffocating silence of the room, it spoke. Its voice was calm, clear, and terrifyingly familiar. It was his own. Your place. The next morning, golden sunlight streamed into Daniel's apartment. The sheets were still tacked over the mirrors, the room tidy, and still, there was no sign of a struggle, no trace of the torment that had unfolded. Outside, life went on. A man in a familiar coat walked down the sun-drenched sidewalk, his stride confident and purposeful. His shadow followed behind him, a perfect, obedient copy. Then, for just a second, the man continued walking, but the shadow stopped. It turned its head, its featureless face looking directly toward us, and it smiled,